The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Hello. Welcome to Examining Fictional Heroes. This is Season 1, Episode 9, and we're discussing exhaustion. That is what the final stanza in the Robert Frost poem that I just quoted is about. Exhaustion. Miles to go before I sleep. I'm sure we're all very familiar with being exhausted. We all have a tendency to push ourselves. And when you're young, you can recover from that more quickly. And you also discover what your limits are. It's more difficult as you age. As I've gotten older, I've discovered what once held me in good stead has become a bad habit that I'm having difficulty breaking. There are many different types of exhaustion. I'm going to be discussing 3 of those in this episode. And I have quite a bit to cover. So, this particular episode is going to be a 2-parter. In the first part, I'm going to deal with the effects of a long grind. The second video, I will talk about the effects of the exhaustion that comes from a short burst or flurry of action and mental fatigue or burnout. But to start, we're going to go with the long strain type of exhaustion. And I believe that this type of exhaustion is very similar to what mountaineers refer to as being in the death zone. When you're above 20,000 feet, the air is thinner, it contains less oxygen, and therefore less of it gets to your brain, and you begin to make poor decisions. I think especially when you have been exhausted for a very long time, you tend to make emotional decisions rather than rational ones. So, the first example of the long grind that I'm going to be sharing with you will be from The Call of the Wild by Jack London. Any of you who are familiar with The Call of the Wild or White Fang, you know these stories were written about dogs, but they are also written about men. There was nothing the matter with them except that they were dead tired. It was not the dead tiredness that comes through brief and excessive effort, from which recovery is a matter of hours. But it was the dead tiredness that comes through the slow and prolonged strength drainage of months of toil. There was no power of recuperation left, no reserve strength to call upon. It had been all used, the last least bit of it. Every muscle, fiber, every cell was tired, dead tired. The drivers confidently expected a long stopover. Themselves, they had covered 1,200 miles with 2 days' rest, and in the nature of reason and common justice, they deserved an interval of loafing. But so many were the men who had rushed into the Klondike, and so many were the sweethearts, wives, and kin that had not rushed in, that the congested mail was taking on alpine proportions. Also, there were official orders. So, the dogs were sold. The men had to push on. My next example will come from this book, The Sowers of the Thunder by Robert E. Howard. This is a collection of short stories based during the time of the Crusades. The story I'm reading from will be The Sowers of the Thunder. Suleiman paled and plucked his beard. Al-Quds, these pagan dogs will slay Christian and Mohammedan alike and desecrate the holy places. And so, Cahal rose stiffly, I must own to warn them. So swiftly have these Khwarezmians come that no word of their coming can have gone into Palestine. On me alone the burden of warning lies. Give me a fleet horse and let me go. You can do no more, objected Suleiman. You are fordone. An hour more and you would drop senseless from the saddle. I will send one of my men instead. Cahal shook his head. The duty is mine, yet I will sleep an hour. One small hour can make no great difference. Then I will fare on. Come to my couch, urged Suleiman, but the hardy Gael shook his head. This has been my couch before, said he, and flinging himself down on the scanty grass of the courtyard, he drew his cloak about him and fell into the deep sleep of utter exhaustion. Yet he slept but an hour when he awoke of his own accord. Food and wine were placed before him, and he drank and ate ravenously. His features were still drawn and haggard, but in his short rest he had drawn upon hidden springs of endurance. An iron man in an age of iron, he added to his physical ruggedness a dynamic nerve energy that carried him beyond himself and upheld him after more stolid men had dropped by the wayside. What he refers to as the deep sleep of utter exhaustion, he also called the beast-like sleep of utter exhaustion in his book, Almeric. Finally, from the book El Borak and Other Desert Adventures, I will be reading from one of the Gordon stories. This story is called The Daughter of Erlich Khan. I'm going to be pulling excerpts from the final 10 pages of this story. At this point, Gordon has been and is in the middle of a great strain. Gordon's head swam from lack of sleep as he glanced down into the blue haze of the abyss, but he did not slacken his pace. He himself was mad for sleep and kept himself awake only by an effort of will that made the hills reel to his gaze. He kept his grip on clarity of purpose as only a man toughened by a savagely hard life can do. Every nerve in his body shrieked for sleep, submerging hunger, but he gnawed a handful of raw barley and flogged his failing powers with the lash of his driving will. In Gordon's state, a man reverts to primitive instincts, and the American held his thrumming nerves in an iron grip to keep from braining the priest with his gun butt. Dispute and importunities were like screaming insults to his struggling brain. Grimly, he marshaled his straying wits. Gordon had never reached the ultimate limits of his endurance. Always he had plumbed a deeper, hidden reservoir of vitality below what seemed the last. Standing still was making infinitely harder his fight to keep awake. The muttering of the Turkomans was a meaningless tangle of sound, and Yasmina's dark, anxious eyes seemed to be looking at him from a vast distance. He thought he felt her arms cling to him briefly, but he could not be sure. The lights were beginning to swim in a thick mist. Beating himself into wakefulness by striking his own face with his open hand, he began the climb, a rifle slung to his back. Orkhan was plucking at him, begging to be allowed to make the attempt in his stead, but Gordon shook him off. In his dazed brain was a conviction that the responsibility was his own. He went up like an automaton, slowly, all his muddled faculties concentrating grimly on the task. Ordinarily, he could not have missed at that range, but his bloodshot eyes refused to line the sights. Slumber never assails a weary man so fiercely as in the growing light of dawn. The figure among the rocks below merged and blended fantastically with the scenery, and the sights of the rifle were mere blurs. And finally, from this story, he lifted his head and glanced at the sun, which was just rising over the eastern peaks, turning to crimson flame the snow of Mount Erlikon. He would have traded all the gold of the monks of Yolgan to be allowed to lie down and sleep for an hour. And climbing up on his stiffened legs that trembled with his weight was a task of appalling magnitude. But his labor was not yet done. There was no rest for him this side of the pass. He still had to get him and his men out of danger. So, we examined the effects of a long strain on a person. Next week, we'll discuss the short burst and mental fatigue. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.